right, good. You know, and I know that it's like the middle, we're at midterms essentially, and I know that everyone is like working really hard, and that like this is basically the time in the semester where like everybody starts to freak out. So I want to start the class by talking a little bit about like the exam, because apparently I could be wrong, but we have an exam, our next class, right? Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about the exam. Are you guys ready? We're going to talk about the exam. Are you guys ready? Okay. So the exam is going to be about 70 minutes. You're going education for the masses, right? You had only a tiny select group of very, very rich men, right, studying this stuff. So I know that it's work. I know that you guys, many of you are here literally against your will, but I don't want us to think of this as laborsome. I don't want us to think of this as sort of like work, right? Like I think that this is, what we're doing here is actually kind of important, right? And it sort of transcends mere labor and all of that sort of thing. Okay, is there anything else I wanted to say? Midterm, exam, conference. All right, so I think what we're gonna do today, we're gonna finish up our discussion. I know it's like I brought tissues. I know that some of us are gonna get emotional about this, but this is gonna be our last class talking about the English Revolution. After this, we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. Yeah, awesome. We're going to talk about Karl Marx, and then we're going to talk about the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. So, like, this is our last class talking about the 17th century. When I designed this class, I sort of designed it around like this idea of what might you guys actually want to study, like in a History 101 class. And I think revolution is just sort of like, it's fascinating, right? And how like historical change actually happens. So what we're going to talk about today, the story that I'm going to tell you essentially is like the beginnings and the consequences of the English Revolution. In other words, in your notes, you can ask something like English Revolution, how it all happened, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. So our last class we were talking, so we're starting like you know. So our last class we were talking about the policy of Thurrow, right? We talked about the plan of Charles I to sort of raise revenue in his realm without asking Parliament, right? So this is about Charles raising funds to support his monarchy without having to call Parliament. So he's like thinking about this. He's like, so what the heck am I going to do? He's like, we need to raise money. I need to make sure that the crown is financially solvent. And what Charles decides to do is actually centralize his power, right? What he wants to do is link all of the three kingdoms together. He wants to link England, Scotland, and Ireland all together, right? This is his plan. So we talked about Archbishop Laud, and Archbishop Laud was like the mastermind of Charles' religious policy, right? So this is Archbishop Laud. He's on religion. But it's the Earl of Strafford that devises the policy of Thurrow, right? So when we think of Archbishop Laud, we should think of religious changes in England. But when we think of Strafford, we should think of him as sort of like the architect of the policy of Thurrow. Charles I is making wide-ranging changes to the church and to his monarchy. And he wants to centralize it in order to make it more powerful, so he can get at his subjects' money more quickly and more easily. So that's what's going on. Strafford and Laud, they're of course good buddies, right? And it's interesting because historians can read the letters that they send to one another. They're not quite as salacious as James I and the Duke of Buckingham, but the letters between Strafford and Laud really tell us a lot about where these guys are intellectually. We should think of Strafford as sort of like an idealist. Strafford is like a pie-in-the-sky sort of guy. And this is who we're talking about here, Thomas von Werth, the Earl of Strafford. So the idea of this policy of Thurrow is to go into rural areas, right, and create government where there isn't any government, right? This is about tying the periphery to the center, right? And of course, the periphery, or the center, is of course London and the monarchy, right? So this is about tying all of the three kingdoms together through this policy of Thurrow. It's about making government more sedentary, right? So instead of like the local lord, for instance, like, you know, exacting justice on the manor somewhere out in the countryside, this is about bringing the king's courts, right, out into the countryside. This is about, in some sense, it's also about like creating centralized power, right? One of the things that Charles I does is that he goes on like this statue building campaign. He goes out into the countryside to put like statues of himself, right? And his father, I'm not gonna follow this really, out into the countryside to make people aware of the monarchy and their awe-inspiring power. So, Charles and this policy of thorough, it's not just about creating government where there isn't any. It's about like enforcing policies of even like relief for the poor, right? So this is the government getting in the social welfare system, right? The monarchy takes over charity. So charities become under the purview of the monarchy. This is important because it helps giving poor people stuff, makes poor people loyal to the crown, right? So charity, public works, and road building, right? So this is something that's going on throughout all of England, all of Scotland, and all of Ireland, right? This is a process of centralization in the 17th century. This, in European history, not just English history, this is going to upset a lot of the nobility, right? So this is about creating monarchical power where there isn't any. And like in European history, as well as English history, this is really going to rub the nobles the wrong way, right? This is about the government infringing on traditional aristocratic rights and traditional aristocratic privileges. Strafford even has gentlemen, noblemen, whipped in the streets for not obeying Charles I's new policy. So it's a situation where government is making itself known in the countryside, and those aristocrats that are saying, Charles, this isn't how things traditionally have been done. This goes against custom, Charles did. Charles has those noblemen whipped through the streets, right? Actually, it's Strafford who does that. So, in addition to this policy of thorough, Charles also goes on indirectly taxing his people, right? So, instead of asking Parliament for money, he's going to try to raise, are you ready for it? Extra parliamentary taxation, right? He's going to try to raise funds. Without the consent of Parliament. So what Charles does is he starts acting, kind of shifty. So he starts reviving old medieval statutes. So he looks back into England's legal code for like obscure ways to raise taxes. The first statute that he sort of pulls out of his hat is called the Distraint of Knighthood. I'll spell that for you. So this is a medieval statute that Charles revives in order to sort of get at his people's mind. That's D-I-S-T-R-A-I-N-T. This is the Distraint of Knighthood. So Charles is he's sort of rummaging through the old statute books, thinking about ways that he can tax his people without Parliament, right? This is all occurring within this process of centralization of the monarchy. So you're like, Dr. Petrakis, what is the Distraint of Knighthood? So those people in the realm, so according to this medieval statute, those people in the realm that own more than 40 pounds of land, not like actual money, British pounds, not like 40 pounds of land. Those people that own more than 40 pounds of land, those people have to be, by law, they have to be knighted at Charles's coronation. So this medieval statute says if you have more than 40 pounds worth of money and land, you have to go to Charles's coronation. This is a statute that goes back to the 12th century. Right, so this is Charles essentially picking and choosing which laws he wants to enforce, and those noblemen, those people that own 40 pounds of land, those that don't come, are fined. Right, so he's fining a lot of people in England for these obscure medieval statutes, right, like the Distraint of Knighthood. The Distraint of Knighthood was originally created in 1278. So this is literally Charles rummaging through English statute books in order to tax indirectly his people. Perhaps the most famous instance of Charles's extra-parliamentary taxation is called ship money. So this is ship money. Ship money was also one of these medieval statutes, one of those medieval customs that Charles is going to use to get at his subjects' money. So the point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that Charles isn't necessarily breaking the law, right? Much like James. Charles isn't necessarily breaking the law, but he is definitely acting against custom and against tradition, right? So Charles is being shifty here, but technically, I mean, the distraint of knighthood, it's a 1278 statute, but technically, it's on the books. So ship money is also a medieval right, where the monarch could levy taxes on coastal towns to fund the navy, right? So it's one of those things where ship money goes back to the medieval period, and it's about levying taxes on coastal towns, right? So it's those towns that are on the coast, it's just sort of like those coastal towns have to pay a tax to the king because those towns are most susceptible to attacks by foreign enemies. So this ship money developed in the medieval period to sort of help fund the English Navy, to protect those coastal towns from foreign invasion, right? So the coastal towns would pay this tax to the king to support the Navy. This tax was only collected on coastal towns, and it was only collected during periods of out-and-out warfare, right? So this was only on coastal towns and only during periods of out-and-out warfare. What Charles does is Charles sort of reinterprets the law. Charles is like, okay, ship money, great idea. What he does is he collects ship money, not just on coastal towns, but in every town in England, right? So it's just not a couple of, Bristol, for instance, or Hull. It's every town in England now has to pay ship money. And he's levying this ship money, not particularly in times of warfare, right? So he's just saying now all of a sudden all towns have to pay it, and England technically isn't at war, right? So he's not really breaking the law, right? Well, maybe he is breaking the law a little bit, but he's not technically acting like an out-and-out tyrant, right? There is some sort of law that he is sort of following. So there's an aristocrat, and this aristocrat's name is Richard Chambers. Richard Chambers speaks out against the taxes. Richard Chambers is like, this, my liege, goes against tradition and custom. Well, Richard Chambers speaks out, and he's in prison, and he's fined £2,000 for his trouble, right? So Richard Chambers speaks out against Charles I. It's like, Charles, this is a gross misinterpretation of this law. Like, what the heck are you doing? Goes to prison and has to pay £2,000. There's another aristocrat, and his name is John Hampden. And John Hampden is a little bit more successful. So John Hampden, he's a little bit more like. He's a wealthy landowner, and he's sort of like a parliamentarian, right? So he's a kind of a big monkey. John Hampden is his name. So what he does is he takes the king to court. He says, my liege, I'm going to take you to court, and they go to court. The court agrees, so this is important because the court actually agrees to hear the case. He takes the king to court, and the court hears it. The problem is that this happens in 1638. So the ship money case is heard in 1638 at a time when the king is actually becoming financially solvent, right? So by 1638, Charles, through his chicanery, or whatever it is you want to call it, is actually being successful at raising revenue, extra parliamentary taxation, raising this money to shore up the finances of his monarchy. So this is taking place at a time when the king is actually becoming financially solvent. He's actually making himself money, and he's getting himself out of debt, right? So property men of the realm start to truly believe that Charles is never going to call another parliament again, right? So people, the property men in the realm around 1638 are saying, holy mackerel, Charles is actually being successful at raising this extra parliamentary taxation. He's so successful that it looks as though he's never going to call parliament again. It looks as though he is going to destroy the traditions and the customs of Parliament and England, right? So this is sort of how property men are thinking about it. So John Hampden doesn't want to pay his tax, right? He thinks that ship money is a bunch of BS and that he doesn't have to pay it because this is a gross misinterpretation of this medieval statute, right? The court rules in favor of Charles I, but by a very narrow margin. And when the court rules in Charles' favor, Charles comes to believe that he has the power. You ready for it? So the court rules in Charles' favor. Charles can do ship money all he wants and all of this. So once the courts rule in his favor, Charles starts to believe that he can suspend. So this is the suspending powers. He can suspend the laws as he sees fit, right? And that it's his prerogative as a divine right monarch to be able to do so. So what Charles is claiming after the ship money case, that he can suspend the laws, any laws, that he sees fit by virtue of his divine right. So this is ship money. It's interesting that one remarkable aspect of ship money is that it starts to drop precipitously in 1636. So 1636, the money that the crown is able to raise from ship money starts to plummet. In 1638, so after 1636, people start to stop paying ship money, right? In 1638, 39% of people, only 39% of English people paid this tax, right? Just a year later, only 20% paid this tax. So what we have going on here is that there is a tax strike going on among the English population against Charles I. So people start to go on tax strike against Charles. So ship money is important because it sort of underscores Charles's shenanigans, right? His outright chicanery of pulling these medieval statutes out of a hat and reinterpreting them. But what the implications of this are is that there's growing discontent against Charles because of his taxation. And we see that the less that people pay their taxes, the less people pay in taxes, it begins to put the court and Charles I on a very tight budget, right? So people are starting to not pay their taxes. The court rules in Charles's favor. It looks as though Charles is going to never call Parliament again, but the English people are going essentially on tax strike against Charles. And so it shows widespread discontent with Charles. And the fact that people aren't paying their taxes makes it so Charles is now on a very tight budget, right? So people aren't paying as much money in taxes, and Charles is sort of like, now he doesn't have as much revenue coming in. If any crisis arises, so this is a key part of the story that I'm telling, if any crisis arises, right, it means that Charles is probably going to have to call Parliament because he has less money coming in than he did before. By 1636, 37, 38, 39, people are not paying their taxes, right? And so what that means is if there's a crisis that happens in England, which there's going to be, it means that Charles is going to have to call Parliament again. And you can best be sure that Parliament is going to have a lot to say to Charles. So, okay. So there's a crisis in Scotland. Okay, so you're like, oh, this is how this is going to play out. So people are paying less money for their taxes, and Charles essentially provokes an outright revolt in Scotland. Right? This is the policy of Thorough. This is about bringing English government to England, Scotland, and Ireland, and he's going to provoke an out-and-out revolt in Scotland. So we talked about James and how James is pretty okay with, and my favorite phrase of James is muddling through. Did I tell you this last class? Did I bring up muddling through? Oh, I did, okay, because this is my favorite phrase. James is okay with muddling through. James doesn't want to think out the logical conclusions of a lot of his positions, right? Charles, however, isn't okay with muddling through, right? So where James was just sort of like me, just sort of like, okay, whatever, you know, it's okay. Charles demands conformity, right? Charles demands religious conformity throughout England and Scotland, right? So where James was sort of like, whatever, you know, we're good. Charles is sort of with an iron fist demanding that everyone believe the same thing in Scotland and in England. So he really does believe in this divine right side. So it's 1633, and Charles goes to Scotland. And he sees how the Scottish church is governed, right? So they have a little bit of a different style of religion in Scotland than in England. In Scotland, they have a Presbyterian church. So the Scottish, in the 16th and the 17th century, embrace the Reformation, and they take on a Presbyterian style of church. I'm not going to be able to spell that way. Let's see if I can do it. I think that's right. Anyway, so you're like, okay, great. You can spell it, Dr. Bajrakis. What the hell does it mean? Okay, great. I'll tell you. So what a Presbyterian style of church is, it's also, you can think of it as like a congregationalist style of church. So they don't have a church hierarchy in Scotland, right? They embrace the Reformation. They, you know, listen to Martin Luther and all of this. And the Scottish people have this sort of popish worldview that any sort of like church hierarchy, any priest wearing expensive vestments, holding a scepter, that this is diabolical and part of an agenda by the Antichrist to extirpate and root out the true religion and all of this sort of thing. A Presbyterian style church government is sort of like the community of believers simply elects an elder, and this is going to be their preacher, right? So in Scotland, they had their sort of like, you know, they're a little, you could say they're a lot less, you ready for it? Formal, right? So the Scottish are sort of so against the hierarchy of the church that they truly, like, they take this idea of, you know, ecclesia as just, you know, like the church is simply as a community of believers. They take this to heart. This is what they believe. So, like, a concomitant in that, or like as a corollary of that, is that they don't believe in, like, you know, having a church hierarchy. They believe that you can simply worship, the community of believers is all that matters, not the church hierarchy. So they think, you know, we'll just have, you know, we'll just worship in like a converted barn, right? Because it doesn't, you don't need an actual church, right? You don't need Westminster Abbey to worship religion. All you need is a community of believers, and they would convert barns, for instance, and worship God in a barn, right? Because the church, the institutional structure of the church doesn't matter. It's simply the community of believers that matter. Their priest is elected amongst the people, right? So it's not like, you know, you have archbishops and bishops appointing priests and all of this sort of thing. It's someone from the community that the community elects. They're not worshiping God in Westminster Abbey. They're converting barns to worship. The point that I'm going to make is that, like, once Charles I tries to impose an English way of doing things on the Scottish church, once the bishops come to Scotland, once the archbishops come to Scotland, the Scottish people are going to revolt, right? So that's the story that I'm about to tell you. So the Presbyterian style of church government is way different than what's going on in England. So what Charles decides to do, because he's an idiot, and he doesn't, no, okay, that's not nice. He truly, I guess a better way of saying this would be that he truly believes in the divine right of his rule, right? And so it's his duty as God's lieutenant on earth to like get people to worship the same thing, right? So he takes this seriously. Insensitive, absolutely, right? So what he does is Charles decides to impose the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland. So Charles is like, the Book of Common Prayer is sort of like the main book. It's sort of like the constitution of the English church that says how you should worship, what you worship, the doctrinal sort of stuff. He imposes the English Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish people. The Scottish are what we might call radical Puritans, right? So what the Scottish people, their belief system, is probably more in line with the Puritans in the English Parliament than they are with the king. So that's an important point. The people in Scotland actually have a church, the Presbyterian form of church government. The Scottish people have a form of church government that the Puritans in the English Parliament would love to have in England, right? Because of course the Puritans believe, the Puritans in the English Parliament, the Puritans in England, believe that they should get rid of the bishops, believe that they should get rid of the archbishops. And they want to, and they would, their sensibilities align much more closely with the people in Scotland than they do with the English king. So here's Charles imposing the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland, right? And what we have are riots. One famous one is called the St. Giles Riot. St. Giles Riot. This happens in 1637. People go to their church. Scottish people go to their church. They hear that they have to use the English Book of Common Prayer, and they revolt. So the Scottish people revolt in the St. Giles Riot. Even the Scottish nobility gets involved in these riots. Usually you would think that the Scottish nobles would have, like, closer ties to the English king than they would just the regular people. But the nobles in Scotland link together with the regular people and riot as well. No one in Scotland wants the English Book of Common Prayer, right? No one. There's riots. All of the nobles get together and sign something called the National Covenant, right? And so the nobles get together and they sign a document saying that they will not allow the English Book of Common Prayer to get a foothold in Scotland, right? So the people all the way up and down the social hierarchy, everyone is against this in Scotland. All of the nobles and the landowners in Scotland vow to stand united and defend the Scottish church against the encroachments of Charles I, right? So Charles is actually provoking a full-on riot. So Charles, because he's stupid, what he tries to do is he tries to put down the rebellion, right? So he tries to put down the rebellion, but he discovers that he can't muster up enough troops. You're like, Dr. Petrakis, why can't Charles I muster enough English troops to fight against the Scottish who are rebelling against him? The reason for this is the vast majority of English people in England have closer sympathies with the Scottish form of church government, of the Scottish Presbyterianism, than they do Charles I and Archbishop Laud and all of their popery sort of stuff, right? So this is about the vast majority of English people have affinities or are more closely religiously aligned with the Scottish church than they are with what they consider the Popish church of Charles I and Archbishop Laud, right? So this is essentially a story of Charles fundamentally changing the English church, making it look more Popish, and then these are attempts for 10 years or 11 years of Charles trying to destroy Parliament. The vast majority of English people see this as a diabolical design on behalf of the popish Antichrist to reduce the English people to popery and make them slaves. This is what the vast majority of English people believe. So they have closer affinities. They're closer to the Scottish system of church government than they are with the English. Charles can't raise enough troops to fight the Scottish because the English people see themselves more closely aligned to the Scottish than they do the English king. So most English, in other words, have more in common with the Scottish than they do the English monarch. So Charles, because he's stupid, appeals to the Spanish to get more troops. So this is confirmation. So Charles is like, fine, we can't get English troops, we'll get Spanish troops. This is confirmation in the minds of the vast majority of English people of Charles using Catholic Spanish troops to put down a godly rebellion against Charles I, right? So this outrages the English people. It's June 1939. No, it's not 1939. It's 1639. And Charles finally scrapes enough people together to form an army. He puts this army together of Catholic Spanish mercenaries, right? And of course, he gets his butt kicked. The army gets routed. Now there's an angry contingent of Scottish on the northern English border, right? So there's a situation in 1639 where there's a Scottish on the English border who have just defeated Charles's troops. This happens in June 1639. Charles has no army to stop the advancing Scots, right? So this is now a full-on crisis. Charles's army was routed. Charles is using Catholic Spanish soldiers to put down a form of church revolt against Protestants. So this is a problem. In 1640, and Charles is forced to call Parliament. So Charles has a situation where all of these Scottish troops are on the northern English border, and they want to fight Charles. They want to invade England. Charles has to call Parliament. This is called the Short Parliament. This is the Short Parliament. Charles, of course, asks for money. When Charles calls Parliament together, there is 11 years worth of stuff that Parliament wants to talk to Charles about, right? They want to address the issue of Laudian innovations in the church. So they want to talk about these changes that are going on in the English church. They also want to talk to Charles about things like rummaging through medieval statute books in order to justify his extra parliamentary taxation. And of course, they want to, this Parliament, Charles is going to dissolve the Parliament, but when Parliament is called again, they're going to call for the execution of Strafford and the execution of Laud. And Charles is going to give them both, right? So Parliament is going to start demanding the heads, quite literally, of Charles's top brass. Okay. Charles, of course, because he's stupid, won't listen to Parliament's demands. And Charles, being the divine right monarch that he is, dissolves the Parliament. And he won't listen to any of their demands. He tells them to go home. He's sort of like, he tells Parliament something like, you have no right to question my divine right. And he says, you guys, get the hell out of here. And he dissolves Parliament. So Strafford, Strafford ponies up some money. He gets, the Earl of Strafford gets some money, and he gets some troops to go north and fight the Scots. So Charles's minister Strafford goes to fight the Scots on behalf of Charles I, right? So Strafford is like, all right, fine, I'll go take care of this, my liege, and all of this sort of thing. And he musters up money and troops to go fight the Scots. Of course, Strafford's army is routed, totally defeated. And it's rumored that some of Strafford's soldiers actually defect to the Scottish side, right? So some of the English soldiers that Strafford mustered actually defect and go and fight on the side of the Scots. And the reason for that is that the some of the English soldiers that Strafford takes with him to Scotland have more in common with the Scots than they do the English king, right? So, the Scots forced the English into a treaty. And this is called the Treaty of Ripon. This one's easy to spell. It's R-I-P-O-N. So Strafford's army is defeated. There's a contingent of Scots at England's northern border. And now the Scottish force the English into a treaty. This is the Treaty of Ripon. Okay, so the Scottish are like, we've defeated two of your armies, Charles. We're at your northern border. The barbarians are at the gates, and they make him sign a treaty, right? And what this Treaty of Ripon demands is that Charles pay the Scots 850 pounds a day. So the Treaty of Ripon says it demands that Charles has to pay the Scots 850 pounds a day until a settlement is reached. What the Scots are turning up the flames here because they know that Charles doesn't have any money. In having an angry Scottish army on the northern border demanding money from Charles is putting Charles in a position where he has to again call Parliament, right? So this is sort of like a crisis situation. Things actually get worse, right? So Charles has a group of angry Scots at his northern border. They're demanding 850 pounds a day from Charles. Charles's subjects religiously have more in common with the Scottish than they do the king, right? And now there's going to be a crisis in Ireland. Okay, so it's like there was a crisis in Scotland, and now there's going to be a crisis in Ireland. So when we think, and like there's a lot of history here, right? When we think of Ireland and English relations, we should sort of think of Ireland as an English colony before the English colonized the New World. So it's like the English behavior in Scotland was one of empire. This is about creating colonies in Scotland, not for the benefit of the Scottish, but for the benefit of the English. So this is something that's been going on from the 1500s all the way up until the 1600s. So in Ireland, particularly in Northern Ireland, oh wait, so yeah, here's a great woodcut picture of the time of what's going on in Scotland. So like Charles imposes the English prayer book, and there's like, so like this is back when people took like religion seriously, right? And so like the guy here is telling his subjects that like they have to worship according to the English prayer book. The people go to church, and they're like, and what do? They start throwing the book at the guy, right? It would be like, like you guys are like, oh, I don't want to read this Dr. Petrarchus, and like everyone starts throwing stuff at me. This is what goes on. They drag the priests right through the streets and all of that sort of thing. Like this is sort of this is radical stuff that's going on in Scotland. So in Ireland, so there's a crisis in Scotland. There's also a crisis in Ireland. So in Ireland, the English, this is particularly around the Ulster plantation in Northern Ireland. And like I know that you guys know that there's a long history of trouble between Ireland and England. This is like the beginning of all of that. So in Northern Ireland, the English establish a colony. This is called the Ulster Plantation. So the Ulster Plantation. So what they develop, like, I don't know, I'm American, I assume you guys don't know this, you probably don't. Like, you know how there were plantations in Virginia, and like they were growing cotton, and they were growing sugar and all of this stuff in the Caribbean and all that. So the same thing is going on in Ulster. They have a plantation society in Ulster. Like the English learned to colonize the world largely through their colonization efforts in Ireland, right? So this is the Ulster Plantation, and it's a plantation society. So the English go to Ulster. The English that come to Ulster are vehement Protestants, right? So They're sort of like Puritans. Ireland is predominantly Irish Catholic or Roman Catholic. So you have a Protestant Catholic divide going on. You have the Protestants who are colonizing Ireland, and you have the Catholics that are living in Ireland, that were like native Irish, right, you might say. So the English Protestants developed this plantation society in Ulster. And of course, if there's one thing the English are, this is true in the 17th century, that they don't like Roman Catholicism, right? So they treat the Irish really terribly. The English Protestants, they kick the Irish off of their ancestral homes and essentially insert them on the plantations. So it's like, okay, so they're like, okay, hi everyone, I'm gonna be your plantation owner. I understand that you guys have lived here for 1,000 years, but now you're gonna come and work for me, and you cannot leave, and I'm not gonna pay you anything, right? So, and by the way, your religion is diabolical, of the Popish Antichrist, and all of this sort of thing, right? So we're gonna take your home, and we're gonna take your religious beliefs, and you're gonna come and work on my plantation. So this is what's going on in Ulster in the 17th century. So, so the Irish are in a pretty bad situation. And the Irish Parliament, there's a parliament in Ireland, that's dominated by these English Protestant landlords. So it's the people, and this we can talk about Karl Marx and all of this, but this is like the people that are the moneyed elite are the ones that are writing the laws in the Irish Parliament. Okay, and these Protestants in the Irish Parliament, of course, have nothing but disrespect for the Irish. But the vast majority of people in Ireland are Roman Catholic, right? So they're dominated by a Protestant elite that's kicking them off their homes and essentially enslaving them on the plantation. So the Earl of Strafford, we know the Earl of Strafford. The Earl of Strafford is like the Lieutenant Mucky Mug in charge in Ireland. So Strafford is in charge of Ireland, creating the policy of Thurrow and all of that sort of thing. He's the Lord Deputy. And as the Lord Deputy, Strafford has absolute power in Ireland. He's sort of like he might as well be the king himself when he is in Ireland. So Strafford's in Ireland, and he's a ruthless overlord, and everyone hates him, right? So Strafford is really sticking it to the Irish in the 1530s, right? Everyone hates Strafford. Strafford is like, doing bad things to the peasants and all of that sort of stuff. Strafford's main concern is, of course, raising money for the crown, right? He's there in the 1630, and this is about implementing the policy of Thurrow. So Strafford is, of course, running roughshod over the traditional rights, not only of the Catholics living over there. So Strafford is over in Ireland raising trouble for not just the Roman Catholics, but also for the Protestant elite in the Ulster plantation, right? So Strafford is in Ireland being essentially like a king, doing bad things to the Irish Catholics, and he's treating the Protestant elites very poorly there as well. So everyone hates Strafford, right? Not only the Protestants, the English Protestants, but also the Catholic Irish there as well. So everyone hates. And so Strafford is like an equal opportunity plunderer. He plunders the Irish Catholics and he plunders the Protestant elites all the while. So it's in the late 1630s. That Strafford leaves Ireland, right? Strafford leaves Ireland in the late 1630s to advise Charles, right? So he leaves Ireland to go talk to Charles in the late 1630s. And while he's gone, the Irish rise up against him, right? So you have a situation in the late 1630s. Strafford leaves to advise Charles in the context of those bishops' wars, the St. Giles riots. So it's during that crisis in Scotland that Strafford leaves Ireland to advise the king. Once Strafford leaves Ireland, Ireland rises up against Strafford and the English monarchy, right? So now we not only have a situation where the Scottish are rebelling against Charles, but we have a situation where the Scottish are rebelling against Charles, And now the Irish are rebelling against Charles in Ireland. So you essentially have a revolt in all of Charles's three kingdoms. You're going to have a revolt in Scotland, you have a revolt in Ireland, and we're going to see a revolt, a civil war, a full-on revolution go on in England. Okay, so the Irish rise up against Strafford and the English monarchy and all of that. The Irish say, you guys have been treating us terrible for like the last 100 years, and we sort of like want some kind of redress. We want some kind of help from the king. The Irish know that the Scottish have risen up, and that the uprising, so they read the newspaper, the peasants, they get up every morning, they have their coffee, they read the newspaper, and they know that the Scottish had revolted against Charles. They read the newspaper and say, why don't we do this too? Strafford is gone, let's rise up against the king, which they do. So the disaffected Irish rise up. They see what's going on in Scotland, and they think they can force the king into concessions. They think they can force the king to give them stuff, right? So they rise up. So what do the Irish want? So you're like, okay, so the Irish rise up, what do they want? They want toleration for Roman Catholics. So the Irish are like, we want toleration for Irish Catholics. They want control of their own parliament. So they want religious toleration. They want the dirty, stinking English poverty classes out of their parliament. So toleration for Irish Catholics. This is in 1640. They say toleration for Irish Catholics. They want control of their own parliament. And they want the English the hell out of Ireland. They want land redistribution, which means that the Irish are asking Charles for all of that land that the English took from them, that they want their ancestral homes back. This is what they're saying. So they started asking for those three things. They want toleration, they want their own parliament, and they want their land. And so this uprising in Scotland, mostly the vast majority of whom are Irish Catholics, it starts to get out of control. So once Strafford leaves, the Irish rise up, and they start to exact vengeance against the English that goes back like 100 years. So when the Irish rise up, they start trying to settle old scores, right? They're so angry, and they finally rise up and they start to settle scores. So the peasants kill around 4,000 settlers. Do I have pictures of this? Oh yeah, we do. Okay. So really horrific stuff starts to happen in Ireland, right? So the Irish rise up, kill about 4,000 settlers, 4,000 plantation owners, and about 7,000 more die of exposure. What the Irish do is they kick them out of their homes and essentially send them packing. So here we go, and this is a woodcut from 1640. Here, English Protestants stripped naked, and they're essentially kicked out, right? So it's like, here's the Irish Catholics saying, you guys have been oppressing us for 100 years. You've taken our land, you've taken our religion, and you've taken our souls, and guess what? Now we're going to strip you naked and kick you the heck out of Ireland. This is exactly what they do. And once they're at it, this is really sort of like heinous, like religious hatred sort of stuff, right? So they strip them all naked and they send 7,000 out into the wilderness and they die of exposure. And then you have like sort of really horrific kind of stuff going on in 1640, where they're like, mutilating bodies and all of that sort of thing. They're hanging people up, feeding people to pigs. I don't even know what's going on here. I think this is like he's pulling toenails out and like some real horrific sort of stuff starts to happen in Ireland once Strafford leaves, right? So I'll just keep moving on. Okay, so that's what happens, right? So the implications of this Irish rebellion are profound, right? So you have a rebellion in Scotland and you have a rebellion in Ireland. So first of all, so the English, they get up the next morning, read their newspaper, and they're like, there's a rebellion going on in Scotland. What the rebellion does is it confirms in the English mind that this is what popery is, right? The Irish Catholics, they're Catholics, right? This is like an Irish Catholic uprising against English Protestants, right? And so the English hear about this, they're reading about this in the newspaper, and what this confirms to the English is that this is what Roman Catholics do. This is what Roman Catholics do to Protestants. This is the popish worldview put actually into action, right? So the English, according to the English mindset, of course this is what Catholics do, right? They rise up. They're gonna kill everyone, men, women, and children. Do horrific things to them. So it confirms to the English that this is what the Irish Catholics do. The English believe that so the English have like a conspiratorial aspect to this. The English believe that Catholic powers in Europe are behind this, right? So they believe, so the English believe that the Spanish and the French are the masterminds. Catholic Spanish and the Catholic French are masterminds behind all this. All right, so there's those two things. Finally, the third thing is that the Irish rebels claim that they are acting in the name of the king, right? So the Irish, because remember Charles is acting popish with Archbishop Laud and all of this, the Irish rebels say that they are acting in the name of the king, and they even forge a document to prove the king's support of the massacre of the Protestants, right? So this is like, the Irish are stoking the fire. So Parliament meets. So this is the context in which Parliament meets. The Long Parliament, so Parliament is going to meet in 1640, and it's not going to be ended until 1660. So the Long Parliament is one that meets for almost 20 years, right? So it's like Charles wasn't calling Parliament and all of this. Well, now Parliament is going to sit for 20 years. And Parliament first sits during the crisis in Scotland and in the crisis in Ireland, right? So there's crisis in all three of the kingdoms. The Irish are killing people, carte blanche, putting people to the sword in Ireland. The Scottish army is stationed, garrisoned, at the English and Scottish border, right? There are English soldiers defecting to the Scottish side. Charles is paying $850 every day until the crisis is settled. So this is the context in which Parliament meets, right? Irish on the border and thousands of Roman Catholics killing Protestants in Ireland. So this is full-on political crisis in 1640. This is the full-on political crisis in all three of the king's kingdoms, in Ireland, in Scotland, and in England. This is like a British-wide crisis. So this is a crisis. There's communication between some of the prominent parliamentarians that were elected to the Long Parliament. There's communication between these Protestants and the Scottish. So the English parliamentarians that are sitting in the Long Parliament send out sort of like feelers to the Scottish. And what they say to the Scottish, they say, we're like you. The English parliamentarians, the Puritans sitting in this parliament, say that we are like you, that we are like the Scottish. We also hate the innovations that are going on in the English church. They have the same interests. So the English parliamentarians have similar interests as the Scots that are on the English border. The parliamentary side has a lot of money. So this is Parliament meeting, aligning themselves with the Scottish, and they have a lot of money. Parliament controls London, which is, of course, England's biggest city, and they control Westminster. So they control London and Westminster. So it's New Year's Day. Actually, it's not New Year's Day, it's January 4th. I know, sorry. It's January 4th, 1642. And Charles goes to Parliament to arrest some of the leaders, right? So 2 years into the Parliament, Charles goes to Parliament to arrest some of the leaders of what's going to be known as the Long Parliament. And it's at this time that the MPs, the members of Parliament, they flee. So Charles never gets to arrest them, and this makes Charles look kind of like a jackass. Charles leaves London because he gets word that it is not safe there for him. Parliament does not allow Charles to have an army. So Charles leaves London. He never gets an army to fight the Scots. Charles is fearful of his life in London, so he leaves. Okay. It's August 22nd, 1642. Charles in the northern countryside, he raises his standard, he raises his flag, and August 22nd, 1642 is essentially when the Civil War has begun. Sweet. So let's take a break. Let's take a break, my friend. I know I'm talking a lot. So let's take a break. It is 12:20 right now. We'll come back and we will talk about radicalism in the English Revolution.
Hello, hello class.
So I just opened the iClicker thing, so right now everyone has their iClicker and all of this sort of thing. Fantastic. So I know that there are some people in the class that are sort of so like we're starting the iClicker now, so you have about a minute to press the A button. So like let's first things first. If you have your iClicker, great. Just press the A button, not the B button, not the C button, not the, oh, look at that, you can see it, good. Now, oh, do you see all right, let's see, can I show you the graph? Because the graph is key. Sorry, hold on a second. Okay, so the graph. Oh, look at this. And like, so I don't know how this happened. I don't know how this happened. And I'm not yelling at anyone, and I don't think anyone is stupid. That's it. So it's just the A button. Just the A button. All right, and like, I don't know, look, now there's people going down, like, I know you guys, so just so you guys understand the magnitude of sort of what I'm trying to deal with here with this large class. So this is good, okay, good. So there's still, and I think it's just an issue that you don't know how the iClicker works. Because I do believe that everyone in the class can discern an A from a B. Like that's very sort of kindergarten. I know you guys can tell the difference, but I just don't know how sometimes this happens. So, and it makes me worry. Like we can take a multiple choice test, right? Like you guys can circle the right letter, right? Okay. So, yep, go for it.
Oh, does anything happen if you press A, let's say twice? Does it like cancel out?
You know, that's a good question, and like you should really, so I guess what we're learning here is that maybe some people need to read the instruction manual that came along with the clicker, okay? Okay, does everyone have a clicker that sort of looks like this? No, all right, so if you have a clicker that, okay, so, but it's clearly marked A, B, C, and D?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, all right, good, so all right, so now, all right. So, there's something called, you know, and so there's a lot of students, not a lot, but maybe like 10 or 15 students that are emailing me about like these issues with the clicker and all of this sort of thing, that like their attendance isn't counting, and like I hear you guys, and it's like if you're in class, it's the sort of thing like, damn you, Petrakis, F you, man, I'm in class, and like if this is just a bureaucratic formality that I'm not getting my points. And I have nothing but the most profound and sincere, I am in profound and sincere agreement with you. I believe that it too is a bunch of BS that some of you are not getting attendance points because your clicker isn't registered correctly, or that there's still 3 people, 4, that there's like it's changing, people just quit pressing buttons, that there's some of us that like are just having trouble working with the iClicker. So like I hear you that like you're here and that you should get attendance points, but like if you look around at the class, this is a really large class. This is a stupidly large class. Like this class is huge. So in my other classes, like where there's 45 students or whatever, I get to know all of the students, and it's a situation where it's like, okay, fine, like you're here, I see you, all of this, I'll put your name down. But for a class this large, when I have so many students here, there has to be, you ready for it, procedural justice, right? So like we all can, and it sucks, like I understand BS, and I'm sorry that I'm a part of it, just so everyone knows. But it's a sort of thing where we all consented to this system by virtue of staying in the class, right? So it's like we consented to the terms of the class with our continued attendance in it. So it has to apply equally to everyone. So I can't be like, I hear you, man, you're here, all of this, and I'll put your name down. It has to be that it has to be registered, and there's still 3, 4, like, why is it changing? Hey, man, press the A button. And it's just a matter of like making sure that you use the clicker correctly and all of that sort of thing. Now, I think you get like 2 freebies on the clicker, and we just started this thing on the 24th. So I think we've essentially had 5 weeks now where we can sort of get this hammered out without any real impact on your grade. So I know that a lot of you look into Blackboard and you're like, holy crap. You see all these zeros and you're like, F you Dragus and this and that. And I get all these emails from frantic students and I hear you. But it's a sort of thing where this rule has to apply equally to everyone, only because this is such a large class. Because if I start making exceptions for anyone, it's going to be a full-on disaster for us all, and particularly me. So that's why we're doing it like this. So I would just, why are these changing? What are you guys doing? Why is there 5 now on the, we have to stop the madness. So all right, so just like A, man, it's the one at the top. So make sure, and then so we're gonna stop this now. I'm gonna stop the madness. I guess 97%, I guess it's one of those things, and like when you guys work with the public, when you guys get older and all of this sort of thing, this is actually something to keep in mind. Because it's like when you guys are managers and you have people underneath of you and all of this, you're going to think that your directions are crystal. You're going to say, what are you talking about? I told him he needed to do this, this, and the other thing, and he did what? What the hell's going on? So it's sort of like when you're asking, so this is for you guys when you get older, that like when you're asking over 300 people to do one thing as seemingly obviously simple as pressing the A button. It's seriously, I mean, like it's still, and it's because, who knows why, right? I know that everyone in the class can obviously discern an A from a B, but I'm just saying that like when you guys grow up, you should be easy on people when they make silly mistakes like this, because it happens to us all. So I'm gonna stop the madness right now, so I'm gonna stop the thing. It's been 6 minutes. Okay. So all right, so we're gonna move on and talk about much more interesting things, and the clicker, and all of that. Okay. So I know, man, I hear you guys. We've been talking about, I've come at you with quite a bit of information so far. What is sort of key to understand, so the takeaway points, what I'm talking about, is that there is a crisis in all 3 of Charles's kingdoms, right? There's a crisis in Ireland, there is a crisis in Scotland, and there is a crisis in England, right? So this is, I know that you guys don't know this, but this is like the 3 kingdoms approach or analysis of 17th century English history. So historians, this is what we talk about as the causes of the Civil War, and these are they. That it has to do with religion and the Ulster plantation in Ireland, right? And it has to do with Scottish Charles's imposition of the English prayer book in Scotland, and his extra parliamentary taxation in England. That's the story that I'm telling you, right? So there's a crisis in all 3 kingdoms, and there is a crisis for 3 different reasons: the Scots, the Irish, and the English. So what the English are essentially going to do is that they're going to overthrow the monarchy, and they're going to create a republic, right? So this is the overthrow, the fighting against the king, and all of that sort of thing. The English Civil War, or the English Revolution, starts August 22nd, 1642. So this is August 22nd, 1642. So they're fighting. Like this is Parliament versus the king, right? So this is the Parliament, and you can think of Parliament as Puritan, right? You can think of Parliament as fundamentalist Protestant, that's Puritan, right? And you can say that this is against the king, who they perceive to be as popish. And we talked about in our last class what popery is and what that means to be popish. Okay? So Parliament starts to enact some radical legislation, right? So they're fighting against the king, they're making garrison towns and all of that sort of thing. So radical stuff starts to happen. They abolish Charles's courts. So the king's courts are abolished. No longer does the king's justice exist in England. So they get rid of the king's courts. They also dismantle, almost brick by brick, quite literally, the structure of the Church of England. Right? We talked about how the Church of England, at the top of the church is the king, who is also the leader of the nation and leader of the church. Right? Then there's the archbishops, the bishops, the priests, and all of that sort of thing. They get rid of this because they believe it too closely resembles the structure of the Roman Catholic Church, right? So they get rid of it. They say that the English church and they're going to purify it of the remnants of Roman Catholicism. Right? So this is what they get rid of the king's courts, they dismantle the Church of England, they get rid of the bishops, they get rid of the archbishops, and they get rid of the House of Lords. Right? It's interesting, even in the context of today's debate in Canada over getting rid of the Senate. Right? So I'm thinking about so getting rid of the Senate in Canada or creating a unicameral system of government where it's just the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, and that sort of thing. This is actually unprecedented in history. I'm racking my brains whenever we talk about abolishing the Senate and all of this, abolishing the upper house, right? It happens during the English Revolution in the 1640s, and it happens after Julius Caesar came to power. He dismantled the Senate, right? So it's I know that Canadians, it's corrupt and all of this, but it doesn't happen in history very much where you create a unicameral government, where it's just the House of Commons, because there's all sorts of shenanigans that goes on in the House of Commons, and you have to have an upper house ostensibly filled with intellectuals and property people to moderate what goes on in the House of Commons, right? Everyone knows this is how checks and balances in government work. So I'm not going to editorialize, I'm just saying that getting rid of the Senate is a sort of unprecedented thing in history. It happens during the English Revolution when the parliamentarians get rid of the House of Lords. And the reason why they get rid of the House of Lords is because the House of Lords votes conservative, right? And the House of Commons, where most of the Puritans are, want to get rid of the Lords. They're like, get rid of the House of Lords. The House of Lords is packed with people that support the monarchy. So they abolish it. Okay, so this is what they start to do. I want to talk about, Charles getting his head chopped off. Because let's face it, that's the most interesting thing. So Charles actually does get his head chopped off. It's January 30th, 1649. The parliamentarians, after much warfare, turning the world literally upside down, they vote to execute the king, right? So the parliamentarians are like, okay, guys, we're gonna vote and kill the king. But before, it's not parliament with all of the members, right? It is what historians refer to as, are you ready for it? The bare bones parliament. So what happens in the late 1640s is some of the important army generals go to parliament and they purge parliament of anyone that isn't an out-and-out radical Puritan. So the decision to execute the king, to execute Charles I, is actually done by, literally, a bare bones parliament. That's what it's called, bare bones parliament. There's an army general, his last name is Pride, and General Pride purges the parliament of anyone that isn't an out-and-out radical, and that's the parliament that votes to kill Charles I, right? So this is a decision made by the most radical Puritans in Parliament to kill the king. Now we know from reading our Kishlandsky article, Charles really doesn't help himself very much, right? Throughout the English Civil War, Charles changes sides. Charles lies a lot to parliamentarians about what he wants to do and all of that sort of thing. But when Charles is finally executed, when they chop the guy's head off, it's sort of done not in the context of jubilation, right? So everybody goes to see the king get his head chopped off. But cutting the king's head off isn't something that's done and everybody's like, oh, wonderful. They chop off Charles's head and everyone's like, oh my God, what did we just do? Right? So there's a general, it's said that when Charles, and this is a great woodcut, look at it, there's like blood pouring out, it's very, and here he is looking up on high, oh my God, he's looking over his stuff. So it's sort of like when Charles does get executed, it's done with a general groan, right? The people see this happen and they're like, holy crap, look at this. We've killed the king, and now the whole thing's gonna come tumbling down. So there's a lot of implications of Charles losing his head. There is a break, you ready for it, in the great chain of being, right? So the great chain of being that justifies the social hierarchy, right, is now rent asunder, right? So Charles, at the very top of the social hierarchy, is the king. This is something that justifies the social hierarchy, that it is at bottom a sacred thing, right? The English have destroyed, right? So there's a couple of implications for this. So what we're going to see happen is that like all these social relationships, and this is the revolutionary part of the revolution, happens after Charles is executed, that like it sort of opens up all of these questions about society, right? So it's like okay, so the king is God's lieutenant on earth, right? That the king rules through God. Charles I was put on trial by his parliament and judged to be a traitor. They killed him. So now what? Right? Now what is what the lunatic, so all of these social relationships come under question. The great chain of being, the sacred thing that justifies the social hierarchy, is rent asunder. And now all social relationships are put under question, right? So the king's dead, what to do now? They thought about this. I love this woodcut because the English are, of course, awesome, right? Who doesn't love the English? And of course, there's all of this great literature that comes out as the result of this. So they think of this, the execution of the king, that the world has literally been, what? It's been turned upside down, right? These are woodcuts of the time. So they believe that the world has been turned literally upside down. What the heck is going on here? What's happening? So we're talking about killing the king, and now all social relationships are coming under scrutiny, right? So it's like this is a revolutionary situation in history, right? So what starts to happen? The world is turned upside down. What is going on here? This is literally the world turned upside down. What's going on? What is this woodcut drawing showing us? Yeah.
No one knows what to do. Like they've never not had a king, so it's kind of like, who will lead us?
Absolutely. So the question is like, how do I relate to other people, right? What's going on here though? What the heck? What is this? It's funny, right? What's going on? Yeah.
It looks like there's fishes flying.
Okay, great. So nothing is the same. So like fish here, you're like, Dr. Petrakis, why is there a fish up in the sky? Things are like they've never been before. The king is dead. The social hierarchy, social relationships are put under question. It's a situation where there are fish flying through the sky. There's a guy with his body coming out of his ass. Right? He's got feet for arms and hands. This is not great, but hands for feet. What's going on? What's here? What's going on here? This is the world turned upside down. What's happening here? The mouse is chasing the cat, right? So the mouse is chasing the cat. The rabbit is chasing the fox, right? What the heck is going on here? The horse is pushing the cart, right? What's happening here? The guy is, I don't know what happened here. The candle is upside down. The church is upside down. This is everything is under question, right? I just want to show you guys this. I just want to show you something. Oh, actually, I'll tell you about it. Anyway, so all of these social relationships are coming under question, and the monarchy's gone. And so the most important linchpin or cornerstone of English society has been removed, right? So this truly is a world turned upside down. So there's significant implications for this. If you think about it, most relationships are characterized, when you think about it, when all of our relationships, very few relationships, are characterized by domination and submission, right? So most of our relationships are characterized in some sense by dominance and submission. This isn't just in marriage, right? Not just in marriage, in our personal relationships, but also also our working relationships as well, right? So it's our relationships like student-teacher sort of stuff, right? It's domination. That's why I'm very keen to not tyrannize you guys, because I recognize that this is like I have power over you guys, right? But also working relationships. So like servant-master relationships come under question, right? Apprentice-manager relationships come under question. In times of social revolution, it is these relationships that come under close scrutiny, if not completely overturned, right? So that's what's going on, because social relationships, particularly in the 17th century, are characterized by domination and submission. It was the great chain of being, this sacred thing that justified the inequality among people, right? The king at the top, and everyone knows their place. Now that the king's gone, people don't know what the hell to do, right? So this is what happens during the English Revolution. And probably the most radical sort of stuff, reformulation for society, comes from the army. So the army is called the New Model Army. And it's from the New Model Army. Oliver Cromwell is going to be one of the leaders of the New Model Army. It's from the army, the New Model Army. And in your notes it can be like NMA, the New Model Army. The New Model Army comes to represent the nation. The New Model Army is the parliamentary army. And it comes to represent the political nation. So in 1647, right before Charles I was executed, Parliament moves to disband the army without pay, right? And so we're going to talk now about the radicalization of the New Model Army and how the New Model Army is the sort of, how they are radical. So in 1647, the Parliament wants to disband the army without pay. The Parliament proposes to send the army to Ireland to fight the Scottish and just live in Scotland from now on. The Parliament wants to get rid of the army, right? Parliament is saying, okay guys, we essentially defeated the king and all of this sort of thing, and they're like, okay Arnie, you're done fighting the king, we're going to send you off to Ireland where you're going to go and hang out. So no one in the army wants to go to Ireland, right? So the parliamentary army is being sent to Ireland to fight, but no one in the army wants to go to Ireland. So the army refuses to disband and declares that it alone represents the will of the people, right? So Parliament is just, at this point in the late 1640s, Parliament has been purged of most of its members. There's just a small group of people in Parliament, right, that are making decisions. And the army comes to say that it represents the will of the nation, right? Because the army has been fighting all of these wars, and the army has been doing most of the dying. The army is composed of everyone, right? It's not just of aristocrats and nobles, but it's composed of regular rank and file English people, right? And they say that they have come to represent the nation. These are, in some sense, ideologically motivated people in the middle. And what they want to do in the New Model Army is refashion society, essentially in their own image. The army accuses the parliamentarians of only wanting to secure their own economic interests. So the New Model Army says that the only thing that Parliament wants to do is concentrate its own power in Parliament, right? So the army is very critical of Parliament. Namely, they start to critique property relationships. The New Model Army starts to critique the institution of private property, because the institution of private property is one of those things that confers distinctions between people, right? So they start to critique the institution of private property. If you remember, all that Parliament resisted, it resisted Charles's changes to the church, but it mostly resisted this idea of taxation without representation. So at the core of Parliament's troubles with Charles is the issue of property. Does Charles have access to people's property without their consent, right? That's why taxation was such a big issue. Parliament, or the New Model Army, says that their disbanding without getting pay is completely unfair and totally unacceptable. The rank and file of the New Model Army start to view the Parliament is just as tyrannical as Charles I. So the army that has come to represent the nation starts to view Parliament in the same way that Parliament viewed the king. So the army generals, they get together, and they realize, of course, that they're very powerful, and they're more capable of refashioning a new society than Parliament is. The leaders in the army realize that power resides with them and not with this bare bones Parliament. So the most radical group is, of course, the levelers. And the levelers are important because what they want to do is level all social distinctions, right? They want to get rid of distinctions between men. They're, in some sense, Democrats. Not like Barack Obama, but they believe in democracy. Well, probably like Barack Obama in the sense that they believe in democracy. So they believe in democracy. The army starts to talk about themselves in a distinctly modern sense. The army begins to talk about themselves as the people, right? This is going to happen in the French Revolution, but it happens first in the English Revolution, that the army says that they are, in the modern sense, the people, and that the people represent the nation. So they put out a manifesto, and this manifesto is called the Agreement of the People. So they put out a manifesto called the Agreement of the People. And what they assert is that political power doesn't come from the king, but rather comes from the people themselves. Power comes from the people. Not like the property classes, but all of the people. So they advocate for electoral reforms. They start advocating for electoral reforms. And the voting issue becomes extraordinarily important. Extraordinarily important. The issue of voting becomes really important. Because, of course, the levelers know that it centers on liberty. A free people have a right to pick and choose who has power over them. And those people that they elect are responsible in their office to those people that elect them. So as the name implies, the levelers want to level all social distinctions. And the levelers are some of the first to make the connection between, are you ready for it, political and social liberty. You can say that the members of the New Model Army who are advocating for this universal franchise, for universal voting, right, that they're essentially like radical Democrats for the time. And they start to talk about making a connection between political liberty and social liberty. So they start linking these two things together, political and social liberty. They start asking questions like, can you be an apprentice who works, for instance, under a manager? Can you be at liberty when you have to work day in and day out according to someone else's will? When you're at the mercy of your boss? Can you be truly free if you're a servant and you have to be responsible to your master? I got 2 minutes. So they're all about giving people the right to vote, right? Because they start to link political and social liberty, right? That you can't truly be at liberty if you're under the thumb of someone else. All right, you know what? I guess we're going to end with that. All right, I know I start hearing people say like groaning. Oh, God. All right, so I look forward to you guys taking the exam. I think it's going to be awesome. I also look forward to talking about like the Russian Revolution and Karl Marx. So we're done with the English Revolution. We're going to start talking about something else. So we're going to talk about like Vladimir Lenin, the Tsar, and Marx. I think that